Hey guys, welcome to the Fighting Fantasy Vault and the first of a series of videos on the history of Fighting Fantasy. That's the general overarching history of the series. And my intention is to do this a number of ways, but to largely use articles. And today's first episode looks at an article in the Warlock magazine. Now, this was issue 1. You can see the cover here. What an awesome cover. It's kind of got this magical energy that's portrayed through the colour on there. And that cover is by Alan Craddock. So that's quite amazing. Now, this magazine was released in 1984. And by that point, Fighting Fantasy was a phenomenon. It had stretched across the world. We had 11 books published by this point. And it's kind of like the golden era. And it's interesting to note that the Warlock was reprinted 5 times in 1982. And this is the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. 10 times in 1983. And 7 times in 1984. So during this whole period, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain is being reprinted, as are many of these books. And you can see here we have this awesome list of Fighting Fantasy books. So they're riding this wave of success. Why the hell wouldn't they do a magazine? Because that was the thing you did back then. And you can see the chief editors are Ian and Steve. And then you've got a Penguin editor, a desk editor, and you've got a team of artists. And the very first article in Warlock issue 1 is One Step Beyond. And it says the origins of Fighting Fantasy. Now, what a great place to start, really, when you're looking at how Fighting Fantasy began. And so what I'm going to do in this video is I'm going to read through the article. You can see here we've got it laid out on the right, but we've also got a zoomed in text on the top left hand side here. And I'm going to read through it, and it's fascinating to hear how they pay homage to Dungeons and Dragons and the influence that had on them. First things to note is here you can see around this article there are some lovely illustrations of goblins and dwarfs by Russ Nicholson, and on the second page there is also an illustration of a Minotaur, which we can have a closer look at when we get around to that bit. I love Russ. He's my favourite Fighting Fantasy illustrator, and it's a pleasure to see so many of his drawings in the Warlock magazines as well. Maybe at some point we'll focus in on those because they're kind of overlooked in the scheme of the Fighting Fantasy gallery, if you like. As many readers will know, the whole Fighting Fantasy gamebook phenomenon stemmed from the fantasy role-playing games that have been around since 1974. At that time, Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson in Wisconsin, USA, first published Dungeons and Dragons, the original fantasy role-playing game. Before 1974, games players were obsessed with diplomacy, a strategic game based on the First World War, which could be played by post. Games were played through various amateur magazines, or zines as they were known. News of Dungeons and Dragons spread through the zines, and it was not long before Gary Gygax and Dave Arneson formed their own company, Tactical Studies Rules, TSR, to promote their game. TSR grew from nothing to a $20 million company in a short time, mainly on the success of Dungeons and Dragons. So we start this article with them instantly paying homage to Dungeons and Dragons. Following up the success, other companies in the United States began to release their own role-playing games. Games designers Workshop produced Traveller, a science fiction role-playing game designed by Mark Miller. A Californian company, the Chaosium, produced RuneQuest, an alternative fantasy role-playing game based in its own game world, Glorantha. Pirates, gangsters, James Bond, and horror are other themes that have had role-playing games designed around them. Role-playing games came to Britain in 1975 when the Games Workshop, working out of a cramped flat in Shepherd's Bush in West London, first imported American role-playing games. So at this point, it's interesting to note, because we've just had Games Workshop mentioned, that there isn't a listed writer for this article. Now, Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson may well have written this. They, with John Peake, are the founders of Games Workshop, which is mentioned in the text here. So they're writing about themselves. And when they mention that Shepherd's Bush flat, and they say the cramped flat, it does make me feel like it's one of those two guys has written this article. All these companies thrived on the success of role-playing games. They attracted fanatical followings. Players were obsessed with their fantasy worlds. Listening to role-playing games talk was like listening to aliens from another time and universe where monsters and magic actually existed. What was it that made these games so popular? And on some level, that does sound like Livingstone's voice. There's a kind of skeptical element to it, and someone who's interested in the business side of the industry. We've got a little subheader here: how role-playing games work. Imagine, now this is interesting, the origins of fighting fantasy, this article's about, but yet it's talking extensively about role-playing games. So it's clearly saying that without the role-playing games, fighting fantasy wouldn't have existed. That's why it's paying homage to it by describing what role-playing games are, which is kind of separate in a sense from fighting fantasy. But let's have a look. Imagine you were playing The Warlock of Firetopt Mountain, but this time, instead of reading the story, someone else was reading the book or the article in this magazine. He would read out to you a reference and ask what you wanted to do. You would make your choice, and he would turn to the new reference and read that out. This is the sort of thing that happens in a role-playing game. But one important difference. In fighting fantasy game books, you are limited to 2 or 3 choices at each reference. In a role-playing game, you have no restrictions. You can do whatever you like. For example, if you're in a passage, you would not be limited to, do you want to try the door in the east wall or continue down the passageway? Instead, you could choose to do anything you like. Perhaps you would like to go back to the room that you've just come from, or listen at the door, or search for a secret passage, or solve riddles, or ask questions. You can do any of these in a role-playing game. How is this possible? The key to the role-playing games is the extra person. In the Fighting Fantasy game books example quoted above, this extra person is just a reader, reading out the story to you and asking for your choices. In a role-playing game, the extra person becomes the games master and has a very important role. Games masters, or GMs as they are known, are vital to role-playing games. They act as a god, controlling the world in which the adventure takes place. They must ask the players what they want to do in each situation. Using either the rules of the game or often just their own judgments, they must then tell the other players what happens as a result of their choice. The GM's role is a bit like the banker in Monopoly, but with no important differences. The GM cannot play the game in the same way as the other players, and the GM has much more freedom than a Monopoly banker. Fantastic. Comparing a GM or DM to a Monopoly banker. The adventurers, another subheading. While the GM runs the adventure, telling the players what happens when they make their choices, announcing any traps that they might have just sprung, and talking for the monsters and other creatures that they come across, the other players are the adventurers. Each different role-playing game has its own rules for deciding the characteristics of the adventurers. In Fighting Fantasy game books, this is quite simple. It's kept simple with the die rolls for skill, stamina and luck. More complicated role-playing games have many more characteristics such as strength, constitution, power, charisma, size, intelligence and so on. These all affect an adventurer's ability in the game. Once the adventurers have rolled up their characteristics, they are ready to play. The GM describes the introduction to the adventurer, and then the players decide amongst themselves what they will do next. Either they will have an overall goal such as find the warlock's treasure, or they may just be on a treasure hunt trying to find as much gold as possible. Their own game characters that they have rolled up do not last for just one game. In most role-playing games, a character becomes stronger, more experienced, the more successful he or she is been in an adventure. Experience points awarded by the GM for killing monsters, finding treasure, or surviving an adventure. Rules are given which convert these experience points into advantages, so that and we'll continue to the next page, an experienced player will be much stronger or be able to use more magic than another player just starting. Thus, players guard their characters carefully and carry them over from game to game. Once you have nursed a character through several adventures and he is now quite strong, you feel very reluctant to allow him to take silly risks like attacking a dragon single-handed. If such an experienced character dies in a future adventure, weeks of care and development will have been wasted. In this way, you can see that role-playing games become very realistic. In a real world, no one in their right mind would rush in and take a dragon on their own. So what's fascinating so far is they've talked very little about fighting fantasy. And it's interesting that in 1984, they feel the need to so carefully describe what a role-playing game is in an article about fighting fantasy. I think it's very telling, and it feels like lifted text from another publication. It's a shame in a way that they haven't, in this description, compared the process of designing fighting fantasy with D&D and had that kind of sit side and them adding little comments and notes about how that then influenced fighting fantasy. Let's carry on with the article. Expanding role-playing games. The original Dungeons & Dragons game was published as 3 barely understandable rulebooklets in a box. The rules describe how GMs could design their own dungeons, how adventurers gained experience, and how battles in the dungeon were fought between adventurers and monsters. So interesting there, it says barely understandable rulebooks in a box. And I think that a lot of people feel that today we look back on the history of Dungeons & Dragons and say with wise eyes, but and can kind of see how difficult the first edition was. But even back then, in 1984, they understood what Dungeons & Dragons was, and that you would craft it and adjust it yourself, and that, you know, everybody played a different version of Dungeons & Dragons, even though they had the same rule box. Fanzines sprang up devoted entirely to this new game, with articles to expand the rules, new monsters and new adventures. As it became apparent that there was no limit to how far role-playing games could be expanded, publishers soon got to work on producing a wide variety of supplements and accessories for the game. And it needed it. Magazines like TSR's Dragon and Games Workshop's White Dwarf provided a regular forum for readers to exchange views and trade ideas. All the successful role-playing games have a wealth of backup material supporting them. The most popular of these are the scenarios or modules. These are ready-to-play adventures which make games mastering a much easier task. In the early days, each adventure had to be designed by the GM, well in advance of a session. Now, hundreds of different adventures can be bought. These are similar to computer programs in that the scenario is usually designed for one game system, e.g. Dungeons & Dragons, RuneQuest or Traveller, but some publishers, notably Judges Guild, produced universal scenarios which can be played using any system. Other common accessories are supplements, additional rules. I don't know what this has got to do with Fighting Fantasy. We're probably getting to it. So we're approaching the end of the article. But I just wanted to point out, in the middle here, you can see there's an illustration of a Minotaur. it strikes me that this is just a small sketch that Russ Nicholson has done. And you can see the outline of the Minotaur raising their hands. Now, this, again, is a visual reference to a far superior drawing by Russ that appears in the Fighting Fantasy Book 1, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain. And you can see him here. Look at the Minotaur. And if we compare these two here, this Minotaur to this Minotaur, you can see what he's done. And he's done a little kind of icon or sketch of this awesome Minotaur. Look at him. There he is. In any case, let's go. This is the last side of the article, the end. So of course it's entitled "How to Begin." The Fighting Fantasy game books are an excellent introduction to role-playing games. There's the crux of the matter. They felt the need to explain what role-playing games are as the origin. They didn't say D&D is the origin. They explained what D&D is as the origin. And I don't know whether that was the right approach to take with this article, because if I was reading this for the first time and I turned the Warlock magazine, I'd be like, I want to read about Fighting Fantasy, not about Dungeons and Dragons. But whatever, they felt like they had to pay homage to D&D and give it the credit it deserved, potentially. The Fighting Fantasy game books are an excellent introduction to role-playing games. Although they lack the freedom and variety of choice that the games are able to offer, they give a fair picture of how fantasy adventures run. A fair picture. Following on from the game books, the next step is either Dungeons and Dragons or RuneQuest for fantasy adventures, or Traveller for science fiction. But Traveller is rather complicated and is not really recommended for beginners. Dungeons and Dragons is the original role-playing game, but many gamers enjoy RuneQuest as the mechanics and the world of Gloriantha give the game plenty of atmosphere. RuneQuest also has an excellent little book, Basic Role-Playing, with simplified rules for first-time players. But having said that, the latest version of D&D is also well written for beginners, and since D&D came out first, there are more accessories available for it at the moment. Any reader wishing to learn more about the various role-playing games available and all the accessories are well advised to read Ian Livingstone's reference book, Dicing with Dragons. Okay, so I wonder whether there's some text lifted from that book as well in this. And it does have Ian Livingstone's voice to it, this article. Fantasy gamebook readers may also be interested to hear that a role-playing version of The Warlock of Firetop Mountain will be published within the next couple of months, entitled Fighting Fantasy. It is designed as a beginner's game. It uses the same rules for fighting monsters as Warlock, but includes extra chapters on how to be a games master, and 2 complete adventures mapped out and well illustrated. Fighting Fantasy bridges the gap between the game books and the more complicated role-playing games. And in fact, we can see that here. Let's have a look at the picture of the cover. There it is. Not the greatest scan, I'm afraid, but that is Steve Jackson's Fighting Fantasy. What can we take from this article? And it is fascinating to look at it in hindsight, because they clearly had a massive hit on their hands. And I'm a bit surprised by the approach of the article. What the article's saying is the role-playing games are superior. We are making our own role-playing game, the Fighting Fantasy cover you just saw there. We are entering into that field. We're moving away from Fighting Fantasy books. It almost implies that, although there are dozens more to come from this period on. So it is fascinating. Did Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone regret moving into a solid Fighting Fantasy approach? And is this article evidence that they were trying to make Fighting Fantasy broader, a more role-playing experience? Is this homage that they've written down here something that is about them regretting that Fighting Fantasy isn't as complex? I hope it isn't. I don't think it is. I think what this shows is the expectations that they have of readers, potentially, and that maybe what they're thinking is the readers want more of a role-playing experience, more of a kind of variety, and that there's this massive American market for it that maybe they can try and push out some content to. The Fighting Fantasy role-playing game never really takes off. It's the Fighting Fantasy books, the simplicity of turning to a passage or a number that keeps this franchise going and careering forward in the publishing world. And it's certainly very interesting to read that. And it's a shame that there wasn't more kind of insight into the development of Fighting Fantasy, or how they evolved it, or what they were thinking at the time, or the origins of it, because in a sense they didn't explain how Fighting Fantasy came about. I mean, the article says the origins of Fighting Fantasy, but yet it doesn't actually say when it happened or how it happened. They're not giving the game credit in my mind with this article. Tell me what you think down below. I'm going to be doing more stuff like this. Is this the type of content that you would enjoy seeing on this channel? Is it insightful? Is it interesting? Any comments down below would be fantastic. This is a new channel, a fan channel, and having your subscriptions would mean a lot and help spread the word. Click that little bell as well if you subscribe, which would be much appreciated if you did, guys, and click the thumbs up. So I will be back soon with some more content. Don't forget, you can see my other channel, DR Games. It's if you search for Toby Lancaster, you will find that, and you can see more about the games that I design that have been inspired by Fighting Fantasy. Okay, guys, take care, and I will see you soon.